Hi everyone. So today we're going to be looking again at the American course, and we're going to look at the consumerism and the American dream of the 1940s and the early 1950s. So, bit of context if you've not watched the previous video, we're heading towards the end of the Second World War now and the recovery of the economy thanks to the Second World War. And we have this second boom after the World War because America is in a much more stable financial state than it was before the war. So life in the USA gradually began to return to normal. So remember, no fighting took place in the USA. US troops traveled to Europe where the war was fought there, and they all had only joined in 1941. So the US experiences 5 years of fighting. Again, less involvement in the war than European countries had, in terms of they didn't have their infrastructure damaged. So, and they'd made a lot of money from selling weapons and so on to countries in Europe prior to their joining in 1941. And because the economy had mobilized everybody, the war had mobilized everybody, the economy had improved drastically. So we do have this second boom and this increase in consumerism. So peacetime goods were produced in the same efficient way that war goods were. Now, obviously, this is a question for RS rather than history, but war does bring positive changes in a lot of ways, medicine being one of them, but also when the demand for something is there, we tend to find ways of getting it a lot quicker. So technological advances were rife during wartime, and we could take those through into peacetime going forwards. So, we can't decide whether war is worth it, but it does come with some benefits, which seems an odd thing to say, but it is true. So luxury refrigerators, ovens and vacuum cleaners, cars and televisions were produced at a price that millions could afford. So if production is more efficient, it's like we saw in the 1920s with the Model T Ford. If production is more efficient, then goods become cheaper, right? So mass production, again, on a big scale using standardized parts, means that goods are cheaper. The more of a good there is, the cheaper it is. That's why limited editions are more expensive. So the public was keen to buy these goods because they had been so rare during the war. So you think about living in a time of austerity and rationing during war. You then come out of the war and everything is suddenly affordable and it seems luxury and you can buy it, so you do. It's like when we came out of COVID and everybody wanted to go on holiday. It's because they couldn't do it during the time. So we want what we couldn't have previously. All right. And these goods were now available to these people. A huge advertising industry and buy now, pay later schemes persuaded people to spend money. Massive shopping centres, which are called malls in America, were built on the outskirts of large towns and cities where people could buy all the goods they needed under one roof. So this is a revolution in shopping. So the buy now, pay later is kind of, we're used to that kind of thing today, where you can buy something and then you can pay in installments later on. Or furniture shops sometimes have on this like buy now, pay nothing for the next year, and then you start paying then. So it means that things are more accessible to more people. Towns and city centres went into decline as people went out of town to shop, a problem that we're still having today. That was reversed a little bit during COVID, actually, because people started to shop more locally rather than going to these big supermarkets. Vast car parks were built to accommodate the growing number of vehicles, and by 1956, there were 75 million vehicles on America's roads. Right, and we can see here a car advertisement from the 1950s, an advert for a Chevrolet Corvette showing a family and their dog listening to the quiet engine. I like the idea that the dog's listening to the quiet engine. But this shows you that there's advertisement for people to buy these new kinds of cars, and people are attracted to it because they can't afford it now. So by the end of the 1950s, 9 out of every 10 US households had a TV. Okay, so that's really big, that. 8 had a car and a telephone, and 7 had a washing machine. So 7 out of 10 homes have a washing machine, which makes things more efficient for women. Okay, and we were talking previously about women's roles, and I'll go on to talk about the feminist movement, but this just makes jobs a lot easier for women in the home, which gives them a bit more time to think about what they want to do with. In addition to the boom in US spending, Europe, devastated by war, was also keen to buy American goods. So they want access to the American market because they don't have the ability to make these goods because they are still repairing their countries from the war. So soon the US economy was stronger than ever, despite having only 6% of the world's population. By 1952, America was supplying the world with 65% of its manufactured goods. So that's massive. 65% of the entire world's goods is coming out of America. Now, today we'd associate that with China. We have mass-produced goods that go all around the world from China, but then it was the US that was driving this. Its growing population was consuming 1/3 of the world's goods and services. After the war, America experienced a baby boom and saw a 40% increase in the population. That's massive. Okay. And that's because men are coming back from the war and then more babies are being born. So America does get involved in the Korean War in the 1950s and begins a fierce rivalry with Russia. So this is the start of the Cold War. As a result, the American industry kept producing new weapons, which meant big orders for the steel, chemical, and electronic industries, which is obviously, again, going to go back into the economy. So we see the war in Korea that America is getting involved with, and then Vietnam. So we have a lot of proxy wars, which means like side wars to do with the Cold War going through the next couple of decades. So that keeps the American weapons industry going. Okay, so government policies also contributed to the post-war boom. So towards the end of the war, a GI Bill was passed to help veterans of the conflict, so people who had fought in the Second World War. And a GI was a nickname for US soldier, so you may have heard of GI Joe. It established hospitals, made cheap home loans available, and offered grants to pay for ex-soldiers to attend college or trade schools. So that's to get them back into jobs, all right? So a lot of men, when they come out of the armed forces, find it difficult to get back into a work environment. So that is to give them opportunities to be able to work again. And obviously that will then contribute to the economy. So it's a win-win situation. So from 1944 to 1949, nearly 9 million veterans received around $4 billion from the government. Now, that might seem counterproductive because if you're paying people this money, you might think, well, how are you going to get it back? But their contributions to the economy will make more money than is being spent on them. So it is worth spending. So we've spoken about the way in which the presidents after the New Deal, they want to be known by something. So Truman wants to be known by his Fair Deal. So he felt it was important for the government to help Americans most in need, as FDR tried to do with the New Deal, and bring about a fairer society. And he calls this his Fair Deal. All right. So the two main issues he hoped to tackle were poverty and the rights of African Americans. And we'll go on to see in the next couple of videos how the civil rights movement is born in this era. Truman raised the minimum hourly wage from 40 cents to 75 cents. So that's a really big increase. And we'll see later that JFK raises that again. And then LBJ raises it again. So each president is trying to get the income of families to be higher, so then they have more spending power, okay? And cleared large slums to make way for affordable housing. However, not everybody supported this. A proposal to introduce a national health insurance scheme was blocked by the Republicans, and an attempt to improve the rights of African Americans was halted when many Southern politicians voted against it. And that's something we're going to come across later. Southern politicians and Republican politicians are against a lot of these reforms that these newer presidents want to bring in because it upsets the way of life of the WASP. So we do, however, have a new president come 1952. He is a war hero called Dwight Eisenhower, and he is a new president, and he is a Republican. So remember, I said previously in the course, we want a Democrat when things are not going particularly well because they bring in new policies and reform. We want a Republican when things are going well because they let this laissez-faire, the businesses go on. So this is a good time for a Republican president to just tick things over. He brought lots of business people into the government to keep the economy booming. So that's a positive thing at the time. They succeeded, and throughout his presidency, the living standards of Americans continued to improve as wages kept rising. So we can see here Truman on the left and Eisenhower on the right here greeting each other. Okay, sorry. So here we've got people were still living in unsafe housing and school, however. So 25% of people were still living in poverty, and people in the South were less well off than in the North and on the West Coast. So there was no National Health Service. So this was born in Britain after the Second World War in 1947, but we don't have that in America. So it's very, very expensive to get healthcare. So either you have to pay for your healthcare in America, or you get health insurance, which again is expensive. A lot of companies do offer that, but there's no NHS. It guarantees a basic level of healthcare for everyone, and that doesn't exist. So our job seekers are sickness pay. So if you are out of work, you get nothing. If you are sick, you get nothing. So it's hard to live in America if you're not sort of in top health and employed. In 1960, 60% of people over 65 had an income of less than $1,000 at a time when average factory earnings were over $4,000. So we can see, again, this big disparity in people who are benefiting from these new policies and people who are not. So we can then see, and again, this leads into the civil rights movement in the next section of the course. Of all groups, 22% of the population, so 39.5 million, are living in poverty. Of white Americans, 28.5 million are living in poverty, which is 18% of the population. And there are 11 million African Americans living in poverty, which doesn't seem as bad, 28.5 compared to 11, but then that's 56% of their population, as opposed to 18% of the white population. So we can see this big disparity between the living standards of white Americans and African Americans. So finally, women. After the war, we've got millions of the women who had done such valuable and demanding work went back to their more traditional roles as housewives. Some of them wanted to, some of them didn't, and I'm going to cover that more in the feminist movement later on in the course. So during the war years, women's wages in factories had risen to 2/3 of those earned by men. So still not the same as men, but then fell back to 53% of that during the 1950s. So by 1950, the average age at which a woman got married was 20, the lowest since 1890. And there are a lot of campaigns to get women back into the home and to get them married. Women were often employed in female jobs, which is nursing, teaching, and secretarial work. And women who attempted to pursue a high-flying business or management career often faced discrimination and were usually viewed with suspicion. There was obviously something wrong with you if you wanted to work rather than being in the home. A widespread and mostly male view in 1950s America was that a woman's place was in the home, and that she was living the American dream if she had all the latest gadgets to help her. So these hoovers, these washing machines, this was the ideal home, right? And I'm going to show some pictures of that in the feminist section. The ideal woman in this time looked immaculate, worked in the home for her husband, and had all these gadgets to help her. However, a growing number of women in the late 1950s, particularly middle class, were becoming increasingly frustrated with their limited lives. So their lives had been opened up by the war and now were being closed again. And they want to experience more. They don't just want to be in the home putting on the dishwasher. I know how they feel. So this is an exam question that you can have a look at. Now, obviously, for the first 3 questions on this course, we get the same interpretation. So you can change this to why, you can change to which is the most convincing. These are 2 interpretations for you to have a look at. So the first one, our workforce and our entire economy are strongest when we embrace diversity to its fullest. And that means opening doors of opportunity to everyone and to recognize that the American dream excludes no one. So this is having, thinking, this we cater to everyone is equal in America. However, this is the thing we've just looked at here. This says the absolute opposite, doesn't it? So this is saying that actually 56% of African Americans are living in poverty, as opposed to 18% of white Americans. They are not being treated the same. They are not being given equal opportunities. They are not all experiencing the American dream. Okay, so that's how they are different. That is a 4-mark question. So by all means, have a go at writing that, but spend a bit of time interpreting them. And please join me in the next video as we carry on the course, looking at African Americans and then finally the feminist movement, which I've referenced both of those. So we've got a good background for those 2 movements now from the information today. So thank you very much.